China does not have a law sourcing from the brain dead, cardiac alive, the accident victims. They have promised such a law, though, and hopefully they'll get it soon. They now acknowledge that organs are coming almost entirely from prisoners. So the debate we have with them is just which sort of prisoners, whether it's only prisoners sentenced to death and then executed, or also Falun Gong practitioners. They have set up a system of registration for hospitals. It used to be any hospital that wanted to could get into the business of organ transplants. Now they insist that the hospital has to be registered with this Central Ministry of Health to do transplants, and they cut down the number of hospitals doing transplants from a couple thousand to about 600. And most important of all, they have acknowledged that sourcing of organs from prisoners is wrong, which is, of course, the global standard. So, I mean, with all these changes, there is hope that they will move towards the ending of sourcing of organs from prisoners. And if they do that, they'll, of course, stop sourcing organs from prisoners of Falun Gong prisoners. However, although there's been all this progress, the situation, as far as we're concerned, has been getting worse rather than better. Because what's happened is that the death penalty has gone down. The volume of people sentenced to death and then executed has gone down largely because there's an international outcry about that as well. China by far leads the world in executions, and China doesn't publish statistics about executions, despite many requests to do so from international human rights bodies and so on. But from the reporting, Amnesty International tabulates newspaper reports of executions, and it's a painstaking process, and it isn't complete, but it at least gives an idea of trends. So it looks as if, statistically, what's happening now, like when we did our report, our estimate was China was doing 10,000 organ transplants a year, about 2,500 were coming from prisoners sentenced to death, and about 7,500 were coming from Falun Gong practitioners. But it looks now, because of the decrease in the death penalty, that about 1,000 organs are coming from prisoners sentenced to death, and about 9,000 are coming from Falun Gong practitioners. So the decrease in the death penalty has led to an increase in Falun Gong practitioners. China has a re-education through labor camp system, and the number of people in that camp are in the millions. Those camps are in the millions. I mean, there's various estimates. Again, there's no official statistics, and it depends which source you go to. The U.S. Department of State puts the figure in the hundreds of thousands. The Lao Gai Foundation puts it in the millions. But the estimate is half or more of them are Falun Gong practitioners. These people who have disappeared, who have refused to self-identify, who have refused to recant. So this group represents a live organ donor bank, which remains in China and in far greater numbers than will ever be consumed through the organ transplants, even at the rate they're going in China. So David Kilgore and I are continuing on this. We're traveling and speaking as much as we can to try to end the abuse. We've seen, since we've started, a lot of movement in this field, but not a solution to the problem, so we're going to carry on until the abuse ends. I'll stop there, and thank you for your attention and this issue, so that every person is aware that the communist regime in China is engaged in this type of ghoulish crime. And Rohrbacher was head of the Foreign Oversight Committee, the Oversight Committee, the Oversight Subcommittee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, and he held hearings on this issue, which I was present at, David Kilgore, and Kirk Allison, who's a University of Minnesota ethicist, there have been other members of Congress who've expressed support and concern. There was a resolution recently passed through Congress that dealt with the persecution of Falun Gong, and some of the members of the Congress who supported that also expressed public concern about this issue. Within the Department of State, we've met with people and with other State Department officials or foreign affairs officials and other governments. And what they tell us, and there's a lot of China, U.S., China, Canada, China, foreign countries, bilateral human rights dialogues. And what they tell us, the different people from different foreign affairs departments who participate in these dialogues, is that the issues raised. China rejects the accusations, slanders of Falun Gong, and that's the end of it. There are some parliamentarians who've. There's a senator named Van Krookels Congressman Krunkelson in Belgium, who's put in a private member's bill penalizing transplant tourism. Same in Canada, Boris Rzuski. There's been changes in the legislation in different countries dealing with the problem of transplant tourism. Israel used to pay for people to go to China, and they stopped that. And Taiwan used to have brokers running charters into China. They've stopped that. Australia used to train Chinese transplant doctors. They've stopped that. There's been a lot of movement in different countries to try to end the abuse of transplant tourism into China. But in fact, China stopped it itself. There is still some transplant tourism into China, but it's mostly binationals, ethnic Chinese, pretending to be Chinese, going in for transplants. It's not. You don't get these huge volumes that there used to be before. Now, if you look at what foreign governments have done, you can say that the rhetoric, and you see how China reacts, you can see that the rhetoric of China hasn't budged an inch. They say the same things now that they were saying 4 years ago. But in terms of activity, they have moved. There's also been pressure within the UN system. The UN rapporteur on torture, Manfred Noack, has raised the issue consistently in one report after another. And he says to the Chinese government, can you explain the discrepancy between the volumes of transplants and the sources of organs? Because the source of organs, according to China, is the prisoner sentenced to death. But the prisoner sentenced to death is cannot possibly explain the high volumes of organs. I mean, the Chinese government, depending on the statistic you look at, there are up to 20,000 organs a year. And as many people as they're executing, they're for sure not executing 20,000 people a year. So where's it coming from? No donation system, no accident victims. Where's it coming from? And China says the statistics about government of China says the statistics that you're quoting about this is what they said to the UN rapporteur on torture. You can see in his report the statistics that you're quoting about volumes of transplants are not ours because we don't produce statistics on treatment, only on diseases. At the same time as all this stuff is on their official government websites. I mean, it's just blatant nonsense. The UN rapporteur on religious intolerance has picked this up. The UN Committee Against Torture has picked this up. It's been raised in the UN Universal Periodic Review, and as I say, what we see in the Chinese response, and there's been a lot of foreign reaction, is verbally nonsense. Practically, they're moving, so my own view is, in spite of the continuation of this kind of verbal silliness on their part, that continuing to pressure is worthwhile because they have changed and they will continue to change. Yeah, if anybody wants a book, I can sign a book. If you want a signed copy.